Today, we're not just showing you the basics, but rather what's new with our editor and our design process. Over the past year, we've made several additions that significantly expand what our content designers can do inside the editor, and we think these are worth walking through in some detail. Salutations, industrialists! I'm Mark, a producer on Gilded Destiny. Today's dev diary is a little different. Rather than pulling back the curtain on a new game system, we're pulling back the curtain on how we make the game. Specifically, we'll be taking a look at the tools and workflows our team uses to build the event content you'll eventually be playing. We know some of you have been curious about what goes on behind the scenes, so consider this a look into our content pipeline from early design to implementation. We'll be covering our design docs process and then diving deep into our event editor, which has seen some significant additions since we last showed it off. One thing that matters a great deal to us is that Gilded Destiny is a game that modders can easily understand and enjoy. A lot of what we're showing off today reflects that commitment, functionality that veterans of the genre will recognize, wrapped in a visual editor that we hope makes it more approachable than ever. We'll see that commitment running through everything from the event editor to our newest additions. So, without further ado, let's get started. Before a single line of script is written, every major piece of content in Gilded Destiny goes through a structured design process. It's a 4-stage pipeline, and each stage serves a distinct purpose. The first stage is high-level design. This is where our team rallies around an idea and agrees on its scope. For country-based events, this is where we decide which historical events we'll be covering and how broadly we're interpreting them. For what we call system events, that is, events that serve as the content counterpart to a game system or feature, such as authority or elections, the high-level design is where we align on gameplay loop and its goals, the key player fantasies the content should serve, and, of course, the overall scope of what this particular set of events will cover. From there, we move into outlines, a quick lay of the land for all the event content we have. Here, we map the general flow of events and their effects, getting a bird's eye view of how everything connects before we commit to specifics. Then comes detailed design, where we iron out the balance, pin down precise numbers, and write the narrative text. This is where the content goes from a skeleton to something that feels like a real piece of the game. Finally, there's implementation, where it all gets built. By the time we reach this stage, decisions have been made and the work is well defined. The idea here is that any ambiguity on content has been resolved due to the detailed design stage, which can also help keep testing as clean as possible. This is in part why the earlier stages matter so much. It's not a glamorous process, but it keeps the team aligned and ensures that by the time something reaches the player, it's been thought out properly. For those of you who have been following our dev diaries, the event editor won't be a stranger. This is our custom-built tool for writing and managing the events that drive much of Gilded Destiny's narrative and mechanical content. What we want to show you today isn't the basics, it's what's new. Over the past year, we've made several additions that significantly expand what content designers can do inside the editor, and we think these are worth walking through in some detail. The first addition is small, but surprisingly useful in practice. The ability to hide and disable code blocks within the editor. Think of this as the visual equivalent of commenting out code. When you're iterating on a complex event, testing different branches, temporarily setting aside logic you're not ready to use, you want a way to deactivate parts without deleting them. Previously, that meant workarounds. Now, a single toggle lets you hide or disable any block cleanly, keeping your workspace tidy and your work in progress intact. It's a small quality of life change, but once you have it, you can't imagine working without it. The next addition is a more substantial architectural change, and one we think will feel immediately intuitive to players who are familiar with grand strategy games. Previously, how we targeted entities in our scripting, which country, which character, which province a piece of logic was acting on, was handled in a way that was functional, but could be cumbersome. We've now moved to a scopes-based system. The core idea is straightforward. every piece of logic now operates within a defined scope that tells it what it's acting on. You can move between scopes explicitly, stepping from a country scope into a character scope, for example, and the logic within each scope knows exactly what it's addressing. This makes complex chains of logic far easier to read and reason through, because at any point in a script you can clearly see what the current target is. Modifiers, the numerical effects that influence your nation, your characters, and your economy, are a fundamental part of how Gilded Destiny works. Creating and managing them, however, used to require more manual work than we were happy with. Our modifier group editor is designed to make creating such a pivotal part of the game easier to do. Here, you can see we expose everything to do with modifiers in one unified screen. Not only the modifiers you want to group together, but also things like conditions and text localization, which would normally be scattered across separate game files. The result is that you can fully complete a modifier in one place, no jumping between files to finish the job. Another addition that will feel familiar to veterans of the genre is on-actions. On-actions are essentially event hooks, defined trigger points in the game simulation that fire automatically when certain things happen. Rather than building complex conditional checks into every event, you register an on-action and it listens for the relevant moment, a new ruler ascending, a war ending, or a new building constructed. When that moment arrives, the on-action fires and does its work. But on-actions serve a second, equally important function, periodic firing of events. An on-action can be set to trigger on a regular basis, monthly for example. And this is actually the engine that drives much of our repeatable content. Rather than leaving the game to decide arbitrarily when certain events should appear, periodic on-actions give us precise control over frequency. How often should a particular type of event show up? How do we make sure the player isn't flooded with content or starved of it? The answer, in large part, is periodic on-actions. What ties both of these functions together is the integration with our condition system. Every on-action carries a weight, and that weight can be modified by the full power of our generic conditions, meaning you can build nuanced, contextually aware responses without hard-coding anything. An on-action that fires when a war ends might trigger a political scandal, but whether that scandal materializes, and how likely it is, depends entirely on the conditions you define. The condition system handles that logic, and on-actions gives it the moment to act. The final addition we're showing today is the one we're most excited about, and we think it represents something meaningful about the direction of Gilded Destiny as a whole. Situations are our way of encapsulating self-contained pieces of game content, wrapping them up into something the game can track, display, and communicate to the player. At their core, situations expose a tracker, a counter that can represent almost anything you need it to. In their simplest form, you might use a situation to follow the course of the July Revolution, or consider the Springtime of Nations. A situation might track the balance of sentiment between liberal and conservative forces across a country as unrest spreads and governments scramble to respond. Or even a situation that isn't on a sliding scale at all, such as if Napoleon III sits on the throne. What matters is not just what situations track, but what they surface. A recurring frustration with games in this genre is that important things can happen without the player ever knowing, or more importantly, knowing why. Content gets buried, consequences go unnoticed. With situations, we're making a deliberate commitment. Content that exists in the game should be visible to the player. Situations are our first concrete step toward that goal, a way to ensure that the stories being told don't just unfold in the background, but are present and legible to anyone paying attention. This is just an early implementation of situations, but we have a lot more we want to do with them, and we'll be expanding on them as development continues. That's probably a good place to end for today. We hope you've enjoyed this dev diary, and as always, if you have any questions or comments, don't hold your horses and trot down to the comments section below. Lastly, remember to subscribe to our YouTube channel, and if you have not done so already, please add Gilded Destiny to your Steam wishlist. Until our paths converge once more, we bid thee farewell. May your destiny be a gilded one.